Good evening, or maybe good afternoon, depending on where you're viewing from tonight. But welcome to Writers in Conversation and tonight's Human Worlds Festival at the University of Southampton. I'm Carole Burns, head of creative writing at the university and the host of this reading series. Tonight's event, as well as being a Writer in Conversation event, is part of the wider program at the Human Worlds Festival organized by the Public Engagement with Research Unit at the University of Southampton. It's running from the 12th to the 22nd of November. Lots of great events for you to check out. If you would like to comment on social media about the event, and we'd love you to do that, please use the festival hashtag #HumanWorlds. So we feel very lucky tonight to have as our guest Stephen Thompson, whose drama Sitting in Limbo about his brother getting caught up in the Windrush scandal in the UK aired on the BBC this summer to rave reviews. I'm going to embarrass Stephen by quoting a few of these rave reviews. The Telegraph said the Windrush story should and will make you angry. It did make me angry. And then from The Independent, a gripping, upsetting, and tenderly told dramatic memoir of one man's ordeal during the Windrush scandal. That these reviews focus on the subject matter are, I think, a testament to the skill he's used in telling this story, because when a story is well told, reviewers just focus on the topic. That might be because Stephen, who lives in Southampton, had published 4 novels before writing Sitting in Limbo, most recently No More Heroes, published in 2015. How he goes about crafting a story, whether it's for the screen or the page, is something I'm really looking forward to talking to him about. So enough talking from me. Stephen, welcome.
Hi, Carol. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. It's still odd to have everything so remote, especially when you live in Southampton, and we really, should have been meeting in person. So thanks for doing this live online event with us instead.
No problem. Yeah, it's the new norm. Or well, if things go according to what the vaccinators are predicting, it might not be so new after all. So it might just might be a passing thing. Let's hope so. But
yeah. Yes, we've had.
I was just getting used to it.
All right, so we're lucky enough to have a few clips from Sitting in Limbo to show, but I thought I'd just talk to you a little bit first about how this project came to be for you. How did you end up writing your brother's story, and how did you even first learn about what was happening to him?
Well, my brother's story, I first heard about it from his partner, Janet, who's depicted in the drama. She called me. I was on a train. At that time, I was living in North London, in Enfield, and I was on my way to Winchester, actually, to teach, where I taught creative writing at the time. So it was quite a long commute. But she called me whilst I was on the train and said that my brother had been arrested. And I straight away thought it must have been some kind of mistake, because my brother being arrested, those two things just don't go together. I said there must be some kind of mistake. What was they arrested him for? And she said, well, actually, maybe I should rephrase that. He's been detained. And then she went on to explain that it was the immigration service, and there was some issue about his residency and whether or not he was allowed to stay in the country. So I was a bit distracted. But anyway, I spoke to her again later that evening, and she explained it fully. And obviously we couldn't quite believe it. So that was the first time I was even aware of the issue of anybody from the Windrush generation being vulnerable to that policy.
Yeah, you thought it was just him alone. He didn't realize how many people from that generation were being affected.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, my way into it was through my brother's story, and even then, it took me a while. It took him a while to realize it was a much bigger story.
Yeah. And so at that point, is that when you decided you wanted to write his story once you knew there was a context?
Well, people will see the film and be able to see what the timeline was. But he was detained twice, and we as a family, it kind of affected us in a really direct way. So we had to deal with all of the the logistics of getting him out and forestalling this um, court order, which the government had managed to secure to deport him, which meant going to court and spending thousands of pounds, which we didn't really have. So there was the kind of nuts and bolts of that to deal with, which went on for months. Once he'd avoided the threat of being deported, then it was a question of, well, how are we going to get him to work? And, because he still wasn't able to work, he still couldn't sign on, he still couldn't use the health service. And it was long after that. And during this whole period, by the way, immediately a Gentleman's article had appeared, and that's when we started to realize it was a much bigger story. And it was spoken about in the House of Commons and amongst other sections of the media. So his story became a cause célèbre in many ways. He went on to, I think it was Good Morning Britain, and spoke to Piers Morgan about it, and it just sort of escalated. But at that point, I certainly wasn't thinking about writing anything about it. When we did finally sit down to talk about it, it was at a period when it seemed as if the government was basically dragging its heels about acknowledging its culpability and accepting that it was part of a sustained policy, the so-called hostile environment. The phrases that we used in the film were true phrases like going after the low-hanging fruit. We wanted to kind of hold their feet to the fire. But as a writer, I was thinking, well, how could I play a part in that? So you're a writer, Carole. So we're fictioneers for the most part. So my first thought was, well, I could write a novel, but it just wouldn't do the story justice. Also, I was very keen for it to reach as wide an audience as possible. So I thought about a non-fiction book. And it's interesting because I see myself as an author primarily. And then I thought about maybe making a documentary about it. So I've got some experience of making documentaries. But again, to get that level of attention, it would mean a really big film with a really big budget. And I just didn't have the experience or the contacts in that world. So I spoke to my agent about it, and he said, well, there's always the option of maybe a TV drama. And at that point, the penny sort of drops. You think, actually, if it's a kind of drama which is very, very heavily based on true events, then that would probably do it. And again, that was, between that initial conversation to what ended up on the screen, a long gestation period, and also a lot of obstacles to overcome.
Yeah. So when you, was it hard to put your brother in a drama?
Yeah, because he went through a very traumatic experience. And we watched him up close living through it, and we were obviously affected by extension, but nowhere near as much as him. His partner, Janet, as well. And he was on board as a consultant, an official consultant. So what I was always mindful of was behaving in an irresponsible way, which would force him in a way to relive a lot of these traumatic experiences. My brother's not the most emotionally demonstrative man in the world, so even when he says he's okay, you have to be a bit careful. So, and again, as a writer, you are always, when you're dealing with other people's stories, I like to think that we do our due diligence. We're quite responsible with other people's stories anyway. So it's all like part of my stock in trade. But when it's your brother, you have to be extra careful.
Yeah. And
but then you also have sorry to interrupt, but then you also have a certain amount of fidelity to, let's call it, journalistic integrity as well. You have to somehow own the story and make it yours, even though it's your brother's.
Yeah. So here you were writing a drama, and what did you need to make up in a way? Because all the facts, I assume, are kind of there. So was it conversations that you just imagined after he described it? I mean, what bits were true?
Yeah, good question. Because obviously now, in hindsight, this is why people keep diaries. I don't know if you do, but I keep a writer's diary. But in this case, I wish I'd kind of kept also a video diary of the conversations that we had, because this is very much a team effort. And how do you approach telling a story for the screen? And I've got a little bit of experience of it, but not that much. So I was heavily reliant on my expert team. So certain things that we wanted to keep in there, like transcripts from the courtroom proceedings, transcripts from the meetings with the select committee at the end of the film, where my brother goes in with his partner Janet to talk about what happened to him, any conversations that happened with anybody that's living and breathing, so any politicians or MPs or and because obviously the BBC has a policy, a public broadcasting remit, to make sure that they present true stories in a balanced way and in a factual way. But at the same time, we knew that we had artistic license because it's a drama. So, and it's not just a question of having a disclaimer at the beginning to say these are things are based on real events, because people who potentially people who could potentially sue you for defamation, they don't care whether you've got a disclaimer or not. They've been defamed. So we have to get that balance right. So I would say that anything that you see in the interactions between the characters, particularly the family members, a lot of that, the dialogue and the scenes were fictionalized, heavily fictionalized. Anything which is to do with officialdom, we stayed closer and closer to the facts.
Oh, interesting. Well, speaking of interactions between family members, let's see the first clip that we were going to show. And Sylvia in the background is going to call that up for us. Yeah, such a powerful scene. Anthony's not admitting how hard this is, really. He's saying, I've got this. And there's all the subtext. We can see how difficult it is. And then he just explodes in this scene.
Yeah. Again, these are the sort of conversations that we're having around how to be true to my brother's character, whilst at the same time remembering that it's a TV drama. Yeah. I guess the clue's in the word drama, dramatic. But it's a character-driven story, so that gave us a certain amount of leeway. And because the facts of the story haven't really changed, well, the challenge was then to show that he's quite a quiet, reserved man who needs to be pushed to the point of anger. And we wanted it to be a slow build. And this is one of those scenes where we're starting to see the first signs of him losing his patience and becoming a little bit more. His eyes are open. The scales are falling from his eyes. This is not a mistake. This is obviously something which has been done at a much higher level than he'd previously believed, and was part of a wider, if you like, conspiracy. And he finds himself caught up in it, and he feels let down. The line there, which is something that I've heard my brother say over and over. I feel like I'm having to prove. I feel like I'm having to beg to stay in my own country, and I'm sick of it. That's the first time we're starting to see him losing his patience with the system and with the country, and even probably starting to align himself more with his Jamaican roots.
Well, you've done that so well in this. It's
Thank you.
Yeah, and the fact that he's not speaking just adds all this tension, because we can see it. In the subtext of the dialogue and in the actors, what the actor is doing as well.
Patrick was really, really good at conveying that sense of a simmering disillusionment. Yeah.
And of course, we know that this wasn't just Anthony who was being undermined in this way and being harassed in this way. Well, we know that now.
We know that now. When my brother was going through it, he genuinely thought he was, at least from when he was detained, he met a lot of people from countries outside of the Caribbean. People from Afghanistan, people from the Indian subcontinent, Eastern Europeans, Africans. But I think he met one other West Indian in the detention center, if memory serves me correctly. So as far as he was concerned, he was one of only maybe a handful of people that this was happening to. And when he was first detained, he thought he was the only one, and so did we. So it just, I think that's one of the things that we need to remind ourselves of, is that my brother's generation, those who came over in the 60s and settled here, they really do see Britain as the home. So it's like anybody being pulled out of their house, any British citizen. So you must see that. You could only see that you couldn't see that as anything other than a mistake.
Yeah. So something I'm really interested in right now, in the wake of the George Floyd killing and the protests this summer, here Trump is not conceding the election in the States. We have a pandemic and there's climate change. You're wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt. Is how one writes politically. How did you go about doing that without feeling preachy? Because that's the risk, isn't it? You end up feeling preachy or sounding preachy, and that's not going to work then as art.
Not really, and I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier on about finding the best format or medium, I should say, for a story like this. I still think that documentaries have a part to play. Not to say that documentaries can't be intimate and character-driven and speak to a wider political issue. But I guess the thing about documentaries is that it's obviously doing that. With fiction, I guess what we're after is something a little bit more universal. If you like, the underlying themes as opposed to the issues. In this case, the notions of home, where do we belong, dual identity, and so on. Family. These sort of perennial themes that we as writers return to over and over. But the issue of the Windrush scandal could have been done very effectively in a documentary featuring a handful of characters. But I think I go back to what I said earlier on. I think I'm a fictioneer by instinct. So I feel as if it's a better way for me to access any story. My last novel, for instance, No More Heroes, was based on a true story. It's about the 7/7 bombings, but if you saw the original source material compared to what I eventually published, it's like night and day. But the essence of the thing is still in the novel. So I think that's what fiction can give us, or in this case, drama. It's this idea that you can move away from the heat of the headlines and get behind them in a way, and get under the skin of real people and access some of those universal themes I was talking about. So there's the politics, but there's also the underlying issues. And I thought we did a great job with Sitting in Limbo, because it centers around a family and people identify with them, and everything that we see that happens to them everything about the Windrush scandal is seen through their prism. So it's a microcosm, but we get to know them as people. So I feel that we've got that balance right. Someone on social media compared it to, and I thought it was high praise indeed, compared it to Kathy Come Home, which is this seminal film from the 1960s, I think it was. I think it was directed by Mike Leigh, and which does similar things. It touches on social issues, but through the prism of one particular, or a handful of characters. But it went on to have an effect at a national level, and it was debated in the House of Commons, and laws were passed, or at least laws were discussed. How are we going to, in this case, it was homelessness and teenage pregnancies and all sorts of other issues. So this is what Sitting in Limbo has done, but it wasn't necessarily my intention to do
that. I meant to tell our audience that we will be taking questions, and so do send them, and I'm going to start asking those any minute. One thing I wanted to ask you, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot here, Stephen, is there's a lot of stories about race right now, and issues of race and political issues about it. And I'm just wondering, what do you think white writers' role is in that? I told you I was going to pick the spot.
Yeah. Well, it's you mean, do you mean specifically when they're writing about race,
Yeah,
or
should they be writing about it? How should they write about it? How can they do it in a way that is, not appropriating stories, and yet, because I feel that people should be writing about these issues. It's a white problem. It's not a.
I think that I've read quite a few articles and opinion pieces and think pieces on the issue certainly since George Floyd, both here and in the States. And actually, there's quite a lot have been written about it in France too, Paris, where I used to live. But the it seems to me as it's easier to talk about it if you're a white writer in a journalistic way, because you can there are some undisputable truisms about the issue, for those who have eyes and ears and hearts to see what the issues are. Um, but it's a different thing, I think, if you're going about it fictionally. And not to touch on the subject about who gets to write about what. That's a different debate. But I think, and I would say this is true for black writers as well, or anybody who's moving into a territory of which they're unfamiliar. The the mindset needs to be tread carefully, I guess. Do your due diligence, and then you can't really do any more than that. So that would be my answer to that question. It's a very basic example being like I could write about um, space travel, but I would have to do my research. But it wouldn't be the same as someone else who's actually you know traveled to space and come back and is reporting back in a very direct and meaningful way. There's always going to be a disconnect, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a massive disconnect. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's no such thing as territory that we as writers we should feel free to go into any territory we want. Some things by their nature means that we have to tread more carefully than in other areas.
Great. Well, I would love to see another clip. This one is from a pivotal scene from Sitting in Limbo. Wow, I just want to clap. And then I want to get really angry. That's a horrifying scene, just horrifying. And between the banging on the door, you can't just knock. They've got to bang on it. The photos that are falling from her hands, and them both saying 50 years. How she is not even dressed. I mean, it's just such a powerful scene.
Yeah, and that's the truth. If truth is stranger than fiction, right? So that was toned down from the what actually happened. So it was a very I use the word traumatic experience, and I don't use it lightly. It's seen it again every time I see that scene. I'm reminded that is it's a pivotal scene, and it's a turning point in many ways, because you can intellectualize about your freedoms, but when it's actually ripped away from you in a very real way like that, then it really even made me think about my situation here as someone who's born, raised in this country, and is a British citizen. It made me question, well, if that can happen to my brother, it can happen to any of us. So we wanted to show that scene, and we wanted to give it its weight, but at the same time, making sure that it was always filtered through my brother's character. So even in that scene, you can see his, whereas another person might have reacted in a more aggressive way, or a more defensive way, might have tried to sort of throw them out of the house, or he was very compliant. He starts putting on his clothes, and he's, because these are authority figures who are in his house, and they're telling him that he needs to go with them. And he's spending more time trying to calm down his partner because he doesn't want her to escalate the situation. So it's that fine balance between outrage, but let's not make the situation worse. And in many ways, that speaks to a different generation, my brother's generation and before. When they came to this country, that's what they were told: keep your head down, do your bit for country and queen, and you will sail into the sunny uplands in your golden years. And that's what they've tried to do. But obviously things have changed now. So yeah, very powerful scene, and if anything, toned down for the benefit of, I guess, easier consumption, because sometimes truth really is stranger than fiction.
What did you tone down?
Well, they were in bed in the real story. They were in bed when the detention said it was Sunday. It was a Sunday morning, and they came a lot earlier than that, and they were woken up out of their beds. There was a presence outside the house for a couple of days leading up to that, so they were surveilling the house. And again, my brother saw those things and didn't see himself as being in any way, shape, or form connected to it. The banging on the door. I mean, when he eventually opened the door, there was somebody standing there with a battering ram. So if he hadn't arrived at the time that he had arrived, they would have actually bashed the door in. So things like that. Yeah.
So do you remember writing that scene? How did you go about it? What did you?
Yeah, it was a very technical scene. In many ways, it had to be choreographed on the page. We went through several drafts of that scene, knowing when to exit and enter, when to what's the highest point dramatically, how do we build to it, what's said, if anything, how many people are going to come into the house, how many officials, who would be the lead character, in the sense of we would stay with this person, would be representative of the immigration service, that person. There were police in real life, there were police and immigration officers. In this case, we thought, just for streamlining purposes, we'll just have one set of officials from one particular department. And those were the sort of things we had. At what point does Janet enter the scene? What's her reaction, and how does it differ between Anthony's? And then how do we bring them together at the end? Is there even a point of conflict between the two of them within the scene? And as you can see, there is, because Anthony's trying to calm her down and trying to say to her, leave that, leave that, leave that. She's like, what are you talking about? No, let him put on some clothes. And like, wait. But he can't wait because he's been taken out. So it's a sense of confusion, but we wanted to try and make sure that at no point did we lose sight of the fact that they're a couple under enormous stress. So very, very, a lot of thought went into that scene.
Yeah. They're an amazing couple in this documentary, and I imagine in real life. It's their relationship is so moving. I love how she kind of teased jokes about her side man, and and as I mentioned, so much of their interactions not actually about the immigration problem. It's other stuff going on, and how often she's also seems to be trying to protect his pride. It's
that's a very good observation, because I think, as I said, my brother is a bit like that anyway. And even when in the scene where they're having to debate whether they should move in with their daughter, for him that is like the ultimate come down. Having to rely on her for food, and money running out, and so that pride, which I think a certain type of man from a certain generation feels. Or a certain type of person. It could be, this is not exclusive to gender. We wanted to get that across as well, because somehow we had to get him to relinquish that, but at the same time, not totally. So he feels like so we didn't want him to be broken by the experience, but some of that pride was definitely eroded. Yeah.
And again, the power of this individual story is, we know it happened again and again and again. Feeling undermined, feeling your pride hurt is not going to be uncommon with all going on. So I'm looking to the side here because we have some questions. Let's see. From Laura. She asks, in Sitting in Limbo, Anthony seems to initially struggle with sharing his story and everyone knowing his business. How do you feel about the idea of catharsis through telling one story?
Well, I'm not clinically trained, but I think probably most psychiatrists or psychologists would argue that a certain amount of divesting of your destructive emotions is good for the soul. But I still think you have to be careful who you speak to. And I don't know, we live in an age where we are encouraged to be open about our feelings and especially those things which are holding us back, or trauma, things that we might not have processed. But I don't think we always necessarily choose the right spheres or spaces to do it in. I mean, I don't think necessarily that social media is the place to do it. Um, and and if you have a platform of some kind, it depends on the platform. So with my brother's story, with my brother, I should say, not my brother's story, he's been all over the media and he's told his story. But I like to put it this way, he's very long on the facts, but a little bit shorter on the emotional cost. And I don't know necessarily if that's always a bad thing.
Yeah.
But that's not to say that I don't feel fundamentally that we should be, mindful of walking around with all of these destructive emotions. Just got to make sure that we talk to the right people about it.
Let's see, from Gabby. She said she knows you've already touched on this, but is wondering what your tips are for finding the balance in writing fiction and nonfiction, and the personal and maybe the political in the piece.
Sorry, did you say tips on how to find the right balance?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll talk about how I approach it because it might be different for other writers. I always think that if you've got we've got good antennae as writers. The more experience you get, the more you can tell when a really good story lands in your lap, a really good true story. But as you know, Carole, that's just the starting point. How do you now turn that base metal into gold? So I think there's a certain amount of cogitation that needs to happen. So, in plainer terms, thinking time. You don't let it sit with you for a bit if you have the luxury to do so, because a lot of writers don't. And eventually you'll start to figure a way to make it your own story, because of course this is somebody else's story. So it's not just a question of changing the names. I always say that you can change the names and you can change the places and you can fictionalize the events, but a very, very perceptive person will still be able to spot themselves in their story even amongst all that disguise. Interestingly enough, they only ever take exception when it's an unflattering portrait, but they're quite happy to take the flattering portrait. Anyway, so if you can do that, think about it for a while, let it sit with you. Eventually, I think alchemically, it will emerge as something different. You'll start to think, okay, well, I'm not interested in that character. I'm more interested in this one. What happens if I interject a fictional character into this mix? And you'll just start to make it your own. It can be quite a long process. Sometimes you'll hear a voice. For instance, if you're writing fiction, I tend to write, a lot of my fiction tends to be in the first person. So I usually fixate on a particular character. And that might not necessarily be anything to do with the true story. It might be a fictional character. But if it's a character that's based on someone real, then I have to try and make them my own. And I think there's also always something of yourself in all your characters. Do you agree?
Yeah.
So if you can access your own, your own bag of tools, what is it that makes you tick, and put them into your main characters, that is another way to make the story your own. But the trick is to make this all look as if the writer is absent from the piece, when in actual fact he or she is very much present. But I don't think the tip is not to focus so much on the facts and the events, and try to find a way to let it sit with you long enough for a new way to tell the story to emerge.
Do you agree with, I think it was Henry James' idea, there was an anecdote where somebody began to tell him a story and he said, stop, no, that's all I want to hear. Do you believe that just knowing a little bit is sometimes better than knowing a lot? I mean, sitting in limbo would be an exception to that, obviously, but
Yeah, I think there's something in that. Another similar example is if you are, like I've been writing a historical novel now since 2015. It's a long book, big work, but which required me to do a lot of research. It's because it goes back to the late part of the 18th century. But what I quickly realized was that no sooner had I started the research process that I wanted to start writing. And I think that's the instinct or the impulse that the writer needs to obey. Because I think the danger would be, no, I still need to do more research. When the story is demanding to be at least started, you can always catch up on the research later. So similar to what you're saying there, it's like you get just enough of what you need to get going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, well, I have one more question, and then we'll go to a clip. I have a question from my colleague Rebecca, and who you must meet sometime. Sitting in limbo, she says, was so chilling and moving. Thank you. How is your brother and family now? And how did you go about writing, crafting the dialogue in this compared to how you might do it in a novel? First,
Well, my brother's, yeah, to answer the first part of the question, my brother's is doing all right. As you know, one of the big um, ambitions that he had when this whole thing started was to get to Jamaica to see my mum, and he's managed to get out there a couple of times since the start of the whole process, and that was, in many ways, that is a big part of going back to your question about talking about stuff and being open about it. He and my mum were able to talk about a lot of stuff, not just what was happening to him currently, but historical stuff, because he hadn't seen it for, so that was part of his healing process, if you like. So I mean about talking to the right people at the right time. So he's doing very well. Obviously, his family, have all surrounded him, and I don't necessarily mean myself and his other brothers, his siblings. I mean like his children and his partner. He's always had that, and without that, I don't think he would pull through. So he's doing great, and he's, like I said, he's. If you were to speak to him today, he loves all the limelight. For instance, that's something that we tease him about quite a lot. He loves the fuss being made. But as far as writing the dialogue is concerned, I do think there's a difference between writing dialogue in fiction and writing dialogue on screen or even in a play script, where the dialogue has to do so much more. Obviously, you've got action as well, but the dialogue has to do so much more. But the trick is to make the dialogue work in a way that doesn't look like it's overworking.
Mhm.
Whereas I think when we're writing fiction, we're writing prose fiction, the prose can pull up a lot of the slack.
So the dialogue can be less what in a novel? Less
Well, I was thinking on a practical level. So the dialogue in a script or a screenplay or a play has to develop character, move plot forward, do backstory, look forward into the future, reveal something of the essence of who the person is, maybe even describe setting, depending on where the scene is taking place. If it's a play, for instance, we don't know anything necessarily about the world beyond the stage, so the dialogue has to do that if we want to bring that in. Whereas a novel, you can do that stuff with prose. But there's another question, I think, is what you're intimating. There's another question about the type of dialogue. I guess it depends on the sort of book you're writing. Some people are very economical with their dialogue in prose fiction. Some people use it in a more uh, liberal way. Some people prefer poetic, alliterative, elliptical dialogue. Some people prefer to, keep it real. I think one of the things that's happened with the novel is that it's been strangled by social realism, and the influence of TV and film in particular on the novel that hasn't been, I don't think it's necessarily been a great thing in the round. But one of the detriments to the novel from TV and film has been the dialogue. Often editors will now look at a piece of fiction and go, well, the dialogue doesn't sound like how people would speak. But you might have intended it that way.
Yeah.
Whereas with film and TV, it has to be how people speak.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I'd like a really a question about Anthony. There was a hint at the end of the film that he and Janet would get married. I'm just completely, utterly gossipy curious.
They're not married, no. And that was fictionalized. But we do tease them about it. What are you waiting for? Yeah.
All right, let's see. One more question here before we get another clip. Someone here is noticing the poster of Marcus Garvey behind you. Does his activism influence your writing at all? And was it an influence on how you approached sitting in limbo?
It didn't approach. It didn't influence my approach to writing sitting in limbo, but it does influence my worldview, and I guess that by extension will obviously influence my writing. I think anybody knows anything about Marcus Garvey, I have a personal, not personal, let's say a emotional connection to him, because he grew up in a part, he was born and raised in a part of Jamaica where my family are from. And I spent part of my childhood in the same locale, St. Anne, the city of Jamaica. And he transcended, if you like, his very, very, basic upbringing, and went on to become the figure that we all know him to be. Many people call him, probably the greatest black political leader of all time. In fact, a lot of people don't even know that he's Jamaican. A lot of people think he's American because he spent most of his, most of his political life in the States. So that narrative of the West Indian leaving and, if you like, going out and sort of, making the world a smaller place for them is something that really resonates with me. But also, that's the West Indian diasporic experience. We are in all parts of the globe now, and even more specifically with Garvey. Garvey was a writer. Garvey was also obviously a philosopher, a politician, but he's probably best known for wanting to. He wanted Africans, and when I say Africans, he meant Africans in the diaspora as well. He wanted them to own that identity and to be proud of it. Many people consider him to be the father of modern Black political activism. Many of his offspring, people like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. Malcolm X's father was a card-carrying member of Garvey's organization, the UNIA. So there's a direct lineage down to where we are now. You mentioned this T-shirt that I'm wearing at the moment. I don't know how many people would make that connection, but I certainly do. But obviously, this is a personal political worldview. When it comes to my writing, I'm absolutely convinced it filters in there somehow. But my primary concern as a writer is character and story, and that universality that I mentioned earlier on, that anyone can access if they have eyes and ears to be able to access it.
Thank you. Well, let's see our last clip from Sitting in Limbo. Oh, the civil servants do not come off well in this film. Alleged children. Did people use that term?
Yeah, and my brother was quite keen for us to stress that the dehumanizing effect of endless conversations with faceless bureaucrats, and it's the telling phrase that, going back to how we get that balance right between fiction and non-fiction, it's the telling factual event, the telling factual line of dialogue that somehow elevates the whole thing. The sort of thing that you couldn't make up if you sat and thought about it for, months and months.
Yeah.
So yeah, they would say things like that to him, your alleged children, your so-called partner, and things like that. Extraordinary.
Mm. And do you think we as individuals need to act differently in those kind of situations, those in those jobs? Are people just doing their jobs?
Well, this is a very good question, because I think it goes back to what I was saying about my brother and the type of person he is. I don't know if you remember, there's a scene where he realizes that he's starting to get frustrated, and he just takes a couple of deep breaths, and he says to Ken, the character, says, "Look, between one human being and another, okay, I know you're just doing your job, but what's really going on here?"
Mm-hmm.
And Ken pauses for a second, because it's not a mask, but he knows, or at least he can intuit, that there's some kind of governmental, sort of policy going around, which is a lot of innocent people have been caught up in it, but he can't actually say so, because it's more than his job's worth. So and then he retreats back to the point where, I'm just doing my job, if you get these things in. And then Anthony says to him, well, okay, let me ask you this then. If I were to do all of that, would that be the end of it? So I think what we were trying to portray here was that even the most reasonable bureaucrat could only go so far.
Mm.
And to answer your question of whether they can behave differently, I guess it depends on the institution. We, in recent weeks, for reasons that we all know, have been focusing on the police and their role within the community, and how they're supposed to behave, and how they're supposed to police, and in particular, how they're supposed to police communities which feel under siege. Those questions are a little bit easier to answer. You know, human kindness. A little bit of some politeness might go a long way. Some explanation as to why you stopped me. Some sense of I understand that this might make you feel uncomfortable, but I'm really just doing my job. So if you can help me to do my job, then I will help you. And it can be it becomes a dialogue. When you go to the local immigration service, on the other hand, where it's quite clear that you're powerless, you don't have recourse to legal representation, probably don't have any family members with you. In some cases, these people are literally on their own. There doesn't seem to be as much incentive on the part of the bureaucrat to extend the sort of courtesies that I was talking about earlier on with the police, because they don't stand to lose anything. By doing that. Sorry, they don't stand to gain anything by doing that. And in fact, they probably end up losing. So I guess the answer to that question is, it depends on the institution that these people are working in. If you're being stopped in the street by a parking attendant, and that parking attendant, you feel like that parking attendant is being overzealous, you've literally just pulled up and they've been hiding around the corner and they've pounced on you and put a ticket on your car. You might think, okay, well, you know what? I've been here 5 minutes. Just cut me a bit of slack. You've got a bit of discretion. And if they don't, you think, well, I'm going to take it up with the local authority. And they might know that, and it might influence their behavior. So again, it all depends on the institution. But when you're if you're working for the government, and this is what the immigration service is, to me, it doesn't seem as if they have a lot of leeway. And maybe, especially when it comes to dealing with people who fall outside of the norms, one of the things I think the report into the Windrush scandal was at pains to point out was that some of these people need retraining. Many people in the Home Office, for instance, didn't realize that a lot of the people who came here during the Windrush, as part of the Windrush generation, came here on other people's passports. My brother, when he was applying for a passport, when he told them that, he said, well, one particular person said, that's not possible. So that it's just the ignorance, which I think speaks to the idea of training, and not just on procedure, but also the differences between the various communities that they're serving. Somebody from Jamaica might have a different set of needs to somebody from Pakistan, might have a different set of needs to somebody from Zimbabwe. I think there can be, depending on the institution, some intervention in terms of how these people should behave. And in other occasions, I think it's just a question of trying to establish some human contact between you and the person. And normally that suffices. At least maybe I'm just optimistic, but that's certainly been my experience.
And I suppose in the film too, these individuals are they're kind of their lack of sympathy, the coldness is kind of indicative of what the state was doing,
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
and that's one of the reasons why it's difficult for those characters to come across as three-dimensional, because they are human beings and they are doing their job, and we've tried to get that balance right. But what we didn't want to do under any circumstances is let the state off the hook.
yeah.
And because they're representative of the state, then the portrayal is by definition going to be cold and insensitive and unfeeling.
Okay, so we are running out of questions, by the way. So you guys do not be shy, members of our invisible audience, about asking questions. But we have an earlier one from Joe. So Joe asked, with younger writers, especially of my generation, and Joe's one of our students, a third year in the writing the novel module, with younger writers becoming a lot more politically aware and involved, where do you see their storytelling going, and what advice would you give to them?
Is the question suggesting that politics or political writing is becoming? I'm not quite sure what the question was.
She's saying that younger writers, the younger generation is becoming more politically aware and involved. And I think we see that in the protests.
Yeah, I think that's undeniable. Yeah.
So she's saying, where do you see their storytelling going, and what advice would you give to them?
Well, if they're fiction writers, and this student sounds like she's on the novel writing module.
Semester.
Yeah, my advice would be beware political writing with a capital P. I mean, I think even Orwell tried to avoid that in his fiction. He's probably the most political writer that there's ever been. But there is also, and this might be contradictory, but there's also something to be said for reflecting the times in which you live. One of the things that, as you know, I used to teach creative writing. And one of the things I used to say was that the easiest way to date a piece of work is to pepper it with too many contemporary references. So in this case, and any stories from this period would inevitably feature COVID, the environment, racial issues, politics in America. You could go on and on. But the job, I think, or the challenge for the writer is to try and find a way to filter those things into stories which are directly affecting real people. Create a fictional framework, and then have these issues impact your characters in meaningful ways. So whether it be the environment or race relations or police brutality, or a bit like sitting in limbo, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with politics and addressing politics, but be very careful that it doesn't become a piece of agitprop. Unless, of course, that's why you get out of bed in the morning and you feel as if you have to. Your fiction should just be a thinly disguised political tract. Yeah.
I don't know. I think we might need some more agitprop right now.
We've got plenty of that to draw from the past.
Let's see. Here, there's a question from Luke who we haven't heard from yet. Did you have a, quote, big break when it came to making your way into the screenwriting industry? And if so, what was it? And how did it happen?
A big break? I think Sitting in Limbo is probably my big break. I mean, I've been writing screenplays diligently and quietly and unheralded for a lot longer than that. But you keep going because you hope and pray in some cases that you'll get that breakthrough. And I go back to what I said earlier on about letting stories sit with you, because I've had a few situations where I felt as if, okay, this was going to get made, or this was going to get to the screen, small or big, and it hasn't happened for whatever reason, and then the story, you kind of revisit it, and I'm in a situation now where stories which I thought would never see the light of day have suddenly come back into existence, maybe in a different guise. So nothing is ever wasted, but I guess the big break is always the thing that with my fiction, with my books. It was my first novel, which was the first, actually it was the first manuscript I wrote, and with this screenplay, it was I think it's the third or fourth script that I wrote. So this one was a little bit longer in the making, but in terms of reaching a wider audience, yeah, I guess this was my big breakthrough. How it came about was by having a very good agent, and I guess we're talking a little bit about the business now, but I think it's probably even more the case with film and TV than it is with books, with literature. The agent plays a very, very important part, because um, you have to get meetings with production companies and commissioning editors of national broadcasters, is a very, very difficult thing to do. But the agents, if they've got the experience and the contacts, that's where they come in. So just to give you an example, my agent was the one who was able to approach a producer after my agent and I had spoken about maybe doing this as a TV drama. It was his job to try and sell that idea to the producers, and he managed to do so. He found a woman called Lila Rawlins, fantastic executive producer at Left Bank Pictures, who immediately said, "Yes, I think we can do this," and had the contacts and the patience, actually, to hold my hand through what was my first experience of writing for TV. So as well as the right subject, the right person, the right agent, you also need a lot of support around you to. But I would say yes, this film sitting in Limbo has definitely been my breakthrough, and the people who I met on the way. Um, I couldn't have done it if I didn't have my agent, for instance.
Mm. And is your agent also is this agent the agent for your fiction as well? Or is that
No, just he specializes in film and TV. Well, in fact, TV, not film. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it seems like he was very helpful, even just you figuring out what form to write in, what form.
Yeah. Very, very influential, and got a lot of knowledge about how to go from idea to screen. Um, we live in a period now as well where I think and just to go back to the conversation earlier on about political writing, I think the creative industries are under pressure to diversify and to be more inclusive right across the board. I don't just mean along racial lines. Um, Working class writers, women, LGBTQ, disabled, you name it. I mean, we've got to shake things up. So the eyes are on them, and I think if you think about it from that point of view, it's probably a little bit. Uh, it probably made it a little bit easier for me, or at least easier for my agent, to convince these people that, look, we just can't keep telling the same stories over and over and over. Here's someone who's got ability, he's got a good idea. All he needs is a little bit of help, and that's what happened. So I think this is a good time for writers who are probably with their noses pressed up against the glass, wondering, how do I get into the industry? And especially if you've been traditionally underrepresented, it's time to get busy and start being more demanding. Yeah, and I would include the literature, the book industry in that as well.
Yeah. Well, and last night, of course, we Small Acts debuted, Steve McQueen's new series.
Yeah.
And a writer we had in Writer's Conversation last year, who I knew Claudia Newland, wrote two of those scripts. So I know he's really excited about that.
Me too.
Yeah. So
Yeah, I think there's been it's been, the BBC have been they were very supportive of sitting in Limbo right from the get-go. And, as soon as they saw the first script, they were pretty much, well, from the first meeting, but certainly when they saw the first script, it's like, right, we've got to do this. And we want to do it quite quickly as well, because, we don't want the moment to pass. I think with Steve McQueen's project, it was a lot longer in its gestation. I think maybe took 4 or 5 years from, I think, initially partnering up with Steve McQueen, but obviously he's a busy man. But this is an ambitious, extraordinary piece of work. 5 films, I think about 2 hours each. But it's in many ways it's a magnum opus, because it starts in the 60s and I think it ends in maybe the late 80s or the mid 80s. And although the stories are quite different, they're very much part of a mosaic of the black working class experience in Britain. And we've been crying out for the black communities of this country, have been crying out for stories for generations. Mm. So we are in a good moment at this particular moment in time. And I do think that it's important that we keep the pressure up on the industry to make sure that it's not just a moment in time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm. Yeah, the Guardian review of Small Acts this morning said something about how apparently we had to write every single Jane Austen story 5 times, and before we got to this one.
There you go. There you go. That's a very good. I didn't see that. And believe me, there'll be more Jane Austen stories as well. She's an industry unto herself, Jane Austen.
Yeah. She is. Okay, we have another question from Rebecca. She says, I also love the way you use different locations. So, for example, the barbers and the club, and the way you contrasted those with the terrible institutions.
Again, very perceptive, deliberately done, wanting to show the community from within. So the places that these characters would normally frequent, we wanted to have more. Budgetary constraints being what they were, we could only have a few. So in this case, we saw scenes that took place in the West Indian Cultural Centre, which is this iconic place in Tottenham in North London. We had, like you mentioned, the barbershop scenes, and obviously most of the interactions between the family took place within the home. We wanted to have a few more scenes, exterior scenes, like in a local market, but we just couldn't do them. But contrasting that with officialdom, and to show how there's such a massive disconnect between these two sections of our community, was deliberate. Even the way, they're shot, the color schemes and so on. There's a kind of warmth to the scenes with the family and the extended support networks, and something a little bit more distant and cold and off-putting about the government institutions. Yeah.
I also loved how some of the scenes were completely just visual, and the opening, for example, and within within moments, just 2 minutes, we see how embedded Anthony is in this world. It's his world, which is also an important point that the film is trying to make too. But you do that with just seeing him on the street and seeing him with the party and
establishing. I mean, I guess you teach screenwriting, so the importance of establishing the world of the story, and obviously with screenwriting, because you've got so little time. I mean, sitting in Limbo was, I think, all told 85 minutes long, so there's a lot to get through. So a lot of the visuals at the beginning, you have to power them up. It's interesting, actually, because I also have taught creative writing. I've taught fiction, short story, and the different approaches to these different forms. But I go back to what I was saying earlier on about the influence of film and TV on fiction. How much pressure there is now on the prose writer to have like an inciting incident, and to establish the characters in their world before anything meaningful happens and all that sort of stuff. That's the influence of film and TV. And like I said, I don't necessarily think it's a good thing. Yeah. But with film and TV, because you've got such a short space of time to do so much, it's almost, if you didn't do it, you just the cost at the back end is too great. So you can't afford not to. The audience has to invest in the characters straight away.
Mm. Well, I noticed that your inciting incident takes place in about minute number 4 in this.
Yeah, and it could be easily missed, couldn't it? Because traditionally, you'd think an inciting incident would come 15 or 20 minutes in. I mean, the amount of conversations I've had with students about where the inciting incident is in a particular story, and this is in prose, where we've tried to break it down in that kind of scientific, almost mathematical way. And half the class would say it was this, and another half would say it was that. And then you have to feel like, as a lecturer, you have to come up with a definition of what the inciting incident is, and then only for some bright spark to go away and research it and go, this proves what you said last week, Stephen. So it just goes to show nobody really knows what they're talking about. But what we do know is that at some point in the narrative, something happens, and then nothing is the same after that. For your character. And I would say that it's the thing that he or she does. So then it's not a passive act. It's a decision that they make, or a choice they make, or something that they do. Which is why I think our inciting incident sitting in Limbo is when he goes down to the immigration center. Sorry, what am I talking about? That's another part of the film. When he is told by his boss that he can no longer work here. And then, okay, so what do I do with that information? And he goes home and he tries to sort it out. So it's a smaller moment, but a lot of people think the inciting incident is when he's detained or arrested.
But that's well into the book. I mean, to the
Into
script.
the film.
So much has happened. Yeah.
Yeah. But everything flows out of that moment when he's let go. Because
Yeah.
up until that point, his life he was just ticking along,
Yeah. He's it incites everything else.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right, we have a question from Gabby. She asks, were you all very frustrated that the government only acknowledged the unlawful detention part for compensation?
Yeah, we were very frustrated. Still are. I mean, I don't know if you guys know, but there's been a report that's come out. I think it came out, no, it's been a long time now, months ago, sometime earlier this year anyway. And none of those recommendations have been implemented, as far as I know. And they were quite, damning, a lot of these recommendations, findings. So that's the first thing. We'd like to see some of them enacted. The full compensation scheme is, it's like trying to roll a boulder up a hill. So people have died without being compensated. People have been deported and not been brought back. My own brother has only been partially compensated. So, as you saw at the end of the film, and that was at the last minute when they realized the film was coming out, it was going to be quite critical of the government approach. They tried to save face at the last minute. They even tried to ask to see if we could show them a copy of the film, which of course we resisted. So yeah, still very frustrated with them and angry. And again, we have to keep holding their feet to the fire because they make a lot of nice sounding promises, whether it be Sajid Javid or now Priti Patel, or before both of those, Amber Rudd, even Theresa May. Money was set aside, I think, to the tune of something like £500 million all in. I think out of that, they've probably paid out, well, certainly less than £500,000. So yeah, very, very disappointing. And it's just like it's like a constant slap in the face. You just when you think you're getting somewhere, you realize actually they're still playing politics and they're still trying to. Of course, in the meantime, people have been threatened with deportation, even West Indians. You remember not that long ago, there was a whole plane load that had to be, a court injunction was the only thing that they had left to them to stop the plane from taking off. So yeah, as soon as you take your eye off them, they're very, very slippery. Yeah, and it's very frustrating.
Yeah.
But in my brother's case, he's got it's quite a high profile case. And he also does what he can for other people who have been in that situation. He's become almost like an advocate.
Yeah. So tell me, what do you think the hardest part about writing is for you?
That's a good question. I think increasingly, it never used to be like this, but increasingly for me, it is finding and justifying, I should say, um, isolation and solitude. Um, because, in this day and age, even if you if you went to the most remote part of the world to do concentrated periods of writing, if you were fortunate enough to do so, even there you would find distractions. So then you start to realize that distractions are not so much, they're as much to do with the external world as they are to do with the interior life of a writer. You can always find distractions if you want them. So that's the most difficult thing for me, is how to get into the. I mean, I'm in my office now and I spend a lot of time in here, but how do you get into that space and stay there? That's the biggest challenge for me. Mhm.
Because you because it's hard to not get distracted, or because you feel a responsibility to be doing something else?
Yes, there's a combination of making yourself available to the world, so people and the world, and obviously your responsibilities, your daily responsibilities, which I really struggle at, um, and 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 shutting out the the addictions, or at least the things that you can become addicted to, like the internet and social media, and um, going for 9 walks when you should really be only going for one, or things like that. So yeah, distractions of your own making and the external world impinging on your space. I find it a real challenge. I'm writing pretty much all the time now, but even that is potentially problematic, because you also have to remember that you need to take a break. But how long does the break last? At what point do you go, enough is enough, get back to work? All those sort of things. So I guess the word I'm really talking about is discipline.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That is my biggest challenge, how to be disciplined as a writer. Yeah.
I will admit that when I was in graduate school, and it was the early days of the computer, and do you remember Minesweeper?
Yeah.
Um, that would be one of my
That,
distractions.
that was your big addiction.
I was so good at it that I
Yeah.
in like 2.4 seconds or something. And I thought, I need to get better at my writing. So I just stopped. I stopped.
Are you on social media a lot?
I go back and forth. I get
Mm,
super busy at the university. I don't.
yeah.
Sometimes I do. And I think what you're
I think
saying,
that's the biggest, but I think that's the biggest detriment to writing
yeah,
that there's ever been.
yep. So what is the easiest part of writing for you? What are you best at? Everyone's good at something. You can admit it. It's okay. What do you
You mean
really?
like from a technical point of view?
Yeah.
I'd like to say that I'm if I'm writing more and more screenplays now, but at prose writing, I think my strengths are, um, and it seems to be natural because it's not a conscious decision, but I think my writing is quite restrained.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, and I used to resist it. There was a point in my writer's life, in the early part, where I used to think, no, I want to create more fireworks. I want to be a pro stylist. I want to be, and then as I've gone on, I thought, nah, not really. I'm quite happy with how I write, and I like the fact that people perceive that in it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Great. Um, you talked about Marcus Garvey as kind of a foundational person for you. What about writerly influences? Are there any writers that you think were really influential in how you write and what you write about? And
Yeah. Um, when I first started thinking about writing, I used to read indiscriminately, I would say. I wish I was a bit more discriminate at the time. But I guess I was, I guess I was, because I, came to literature quite late. Um, I would even describe myself as an autodidact in that respect. I think I did a couple of creative writing courses, and that was it. Going back to that early point you made about I got just enough for me to get going. So I didn't study literature. There were no books in my house when I was growing up. I didn't do an English degree or anything like that. So I think in amongst all of those books that I read, a few authors really leapt out, and a few books of theirs leapt out. And so they because I always hesitate to use the word influence, but I think I know what you mean. What, did they almost, these writers legitimize what you were doing, made you feel as if this is something worth doing. So in that category, for me, it was writers like or Hanif Qureshi, V.S. Naipaul, Toni Morrison, uh, I would say Gabriel Garcia Marquez, just to name a handful, because when I first started reading fiction, it was in the late 80s, early 90s, and these writers, pretty much all of them, had really big, with the exception of Naipaul, whose novel House of Mrs. Biswas came out in the 60s. The rest of them, they were just starting to sort of become known as, Rushdie was in that mix as well with Midnight's Children. We're talking Qureshi had just published Wood of Suburbia. Garcia Marquez had just published 100 Years of Solitude, and I think shortly after that came out with Love and Time of Cholera, which is my favorite novel of his. And I think Beloved was published in 1988, Toni Morrison. So it was a timing thing as much as anything else. But those particular writers and those particular books that I mentioned gave me the feeling. I remember reading, after I read Love in a Time of Cholera, and remember, this is in translation, because obviously the original was in Spanish. I remember thinking, because there's two ways you can go with a novel as good as that. You can either be intimidated out of existence, or you can think, actually, what? I'd like to have an effect on a reader like this guy's just had on me, and that's the path I chose to go down.
Great. So I think we have one more question from Nicole. So Nicole asks, how long did it take to write Sitting in Limbo, and what was the writing process?
Okay, so from idea to page, I would say 3 months. And that's just to get the first draft done.
That's
Yeah. And that's because the pressure was coming on from the BBC. They wanted it turned around quite quickly. Because I think, if we are writing anything in a concentrated manner, even unless it's a massive tome, 3 months of concentrated writing should really break the back of it, I think, if we're doing it every day in a disciplined way. But as we know, Carole, that's just the first draft. That is very unlikely to see the light of day, and there might be another year of work after that. So the first draft of the script took about 3 months, and then the other part of the question was, what was the process? Yeah. So it was a question.
Your first drafts. How rough are your first drafts?
Well, my if I'm writing books, they're very rough. In fact, so rough I wouldn't show them to anyone. But in this case, because it was a collegiate effort, and so many people, there were a lot of cooks involved in the process. You have to do the draft quickly, and then you have to show it to the people who are, the stakeholders, to the BBC, the production company, the script editors, and so on. Even after a much later stage, the director and the producers, and everybody will give their take on it and give you notes. And then it's just a question of, okay, well, you have to remember that, we're all trying to make the best TV drama we can make. So I'm used to working on my own in a room with my laptop and my idea, and I please myself, and then a much later stage, my literary agent, and hopefully after that, the publisher. There are a lot more people to please when you're writing for TV. And that, in many ways, is can be the downside of it. But you have to steer a path through that. So that process was a learning curve for me, because that's the first time I'd ever done it. And it can be quite stressful, because you do have to remember that what we often see on the screen has gone through so many different eyes and so many different hands, and a very, very long and exhaustive process, and sometimes to the detriment of the work, I think.
Mm.
But because this was a particular story, the BBC were quite keen for it to be told in an authentic way, the sort of story that, or sort of family, or sort of character that we very rarely see on screen. I was given a certain amount of leeway. So it wasn't, if it was a totally fictitious construct, it might have been more by committee and it might have been not very good.
Mm.
But there was still a lot of eyes and hands on it other than mine. And so after that initial 3 month period, we're talking maybe another 5 or 6 months before we were in a position where we were about to shoot.
Was there anything that they wanted you to change that you just refused?
No, actually, and I thought there would be.
Mm-hmm.
I thought we were going to have more battles over things, but no, they were quite good, the BBC, and it's the BBC really because they're the broadcasters,
Mm.
and if they're not prepared to broadcast it, then there's just no point doing it.
Yeah.
So, but they were quite, quite supportive, and the main challenge with the BBC was making sure that for them, was making sure that anything which purports to be factual was actually factual,
Right.
because they just can't run foul of the government in that way, or because essentially this is an attack on the government, specifically the Home Office. And the BBC just didn't want to lay themselves open to accusations of being lackadaisical in their approach to the story, and not doing their carrying out their due diligence, and just making sweeping allegations and accusations about people who really live, and jeopardizing their reputations, and maybe even their jobs. So as long as we can convince them that here is the paper trail for all these things that we're talking about, they were like, okay, now the fictitious stuff, you can go away and do that. And then the internal discussions, creative discussions, was between myself and the production company.
Mm-hmm.
So you see what I mean? They're the kind of
Mm-hmm.
the overlords, but the real creative work is done between myself and the production company.
Mm-hmm.
And they're quite hands on. So
yeah. Well, it ended up with such a wonderful production. I mean, it's just it's a beautiful script, it's a beautiful film, and
we're very proud of it. Yeah,
it could be. And well, it's people might be clapping in silence. I thought I would clap for thank you so much, Stephen.
No problem. Thank you.
Just great. So I want to tell you about our Writers in Conversations that are coming up, and then I'll also tell you about the Human Worlds Festival. So on Saturday, there's a Hands-on Humanities Day that Tracy Chevalier is one of our Writers in Conversations on that day as well. She'll be talking about A Single Thread, which is set after World War I in Winchester and Cathedral. And you'll be able to find that link on the Human Worlds Festival page, as well as the Writers in Conversation page. I'll mention before we get on to Hands-on Humanities Day that Writers in Conversation will pause now until after Christmas, but we will be having the American writer Gish Jen in February, and the Scottish writer who now lives in America, Margot Livesey, in March, as well as our own Rebecca Smith in May, when her new novel, The Ash Museum, is published. So, but getting back to the Human Worlds Festival, before you go, if you could please, well, here's the Hands-on Humanities Day slide, and you can go to the website to find the very many wonderful events going on, including the Saturday Hands-on Humanities Day. It is also, here's the Human Worlds Festival, which you can get to. And also, if you could do us a favor, and before you go, help us out and let us know your thoughts about today's session so that we can improve future events by taking part by looking at your responses to the short anonymous survey. So you can scan the QR code with your phone, or click on the link in the chat. So I think that's all our official business. I just feel like I've just told somebody it's like the end version of pointing out where the fire exits are. But do just thank you for all the invisible audience. I hate not being able to see you. And for those of you close to Southampton, hopefully we'll be doing these kind of things in person again soon. So, Stephen, you've been just a fascinating, wonderful guest. Congratulations on a wonderful drama, and good luck with that historical novel.
Yeah. Maybe you'll have me on again, Carole, to talk about it.
Love it. We'll do it when it's in person.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Thanks to everyone, and we'll see you somewhere soon.
Bye.
Bye.